I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The night of the wedding reception at Belvoir Hall had begun with a kind of elegance that would later be whispered about in hushed tones of irony. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors. Champagne glasses clinked in a symphony of wealth, and the bride, radiant in white silk, had been the center of all eyes. Lady Helena Frobisher, newlywed to the respectable but rather unimaginative Mr. Charles Frobisher, had seemed the very image of aristocratic serenity. Yet it was not her husband who drew a scandalous stir from the guests. It was the kiss. For before 100 startled witnesses, the bride had turned, not to her groom, but to his younger brother, Captain Henry Frobisher, and pressed her lips upon his with a tenderness that was unmistakably deliberate. Gasps had followed. Laughter, too, nervous and cruel. The groom had stood frozen, a glass of champagne trembling in his hand, while Helena, serene as a statue, took her seat at the grand table as if nothing were amiss. Society, of course, would feast on the incident for weeks. But what followed turned a scandal into a tragedy. The morning after, when dawn light pierced the high windows of the hall, the household awoke to chaos. Captain Henry was found in the conservatory, sprawled among the orchids, his face pale as ivory, his body unnaturally still. The doctor, summoned in haste, shook his head gravely. "Poison," he murmured. "A swift and merciless death." And so the kiss, which had begun as a social outrage, now became a riddle dripping with menace. Did the bride, with her brazen defiance, mark Henry for death? Was it the groom, humiliated before his peers, who sought revenge? Or had another guest seized the opportunity to silence Henry for reasons hidden behind the polished facade of high society? By the time whispers grew into accusations, a quiet telegram had already been dispatched across London. Within 2 days, a compact gentleman with immaculately waxed mustaches and a stride of impeccable precision arrived at Belvoir Hall. Hercule Poirot had come, not for the scandal, nor for the gossip, but for the truth. The car that conveyed Poirot from the station rolled up the gravel approach as a pale September sun pushed through mist. Belvoir Hall seemed to bridle its scandal. Even the fountains played with guilty softness. Poirot stepped out, immaculate, and followed the butler, Pritchard, to the morning room where the principal figures waited in a silence not quite polite enough to be peace. Charles Frobisher stood rigid at the mantel. Lady Helena sat very straight, gloved hands folded, a narrow black ribbon at her throat that looked less like grief than decision. Aunt Agatha Chudley occupied a wing chair like a pulpit. Dr. Latham kept to the window. Mr. Arkwright, the estate manager, smelled faintly of soil. Oliver Trent, best man and family solicitor, watched with the distracted air of a man who prefers paper quarrels. Poirot bowed as if setting a small clock to the correct minute. "Mesdames, messieurs, I offer you my condolences. We will begin, if you please, with the order." He asked Charles for a plain account of the hours after the toast. The bride's parents retired before midnight. The orchestra played until 1. Henry, flushed and restless, drifted toward the conservatory with a glass he did not finish. The house thinned with sleep. Charles soothed guests and dismissed the band. He had not gone near the conservatory and had exchanged not one private word with his wife after the scandal of the kiss. Helena spoke without prompting. Her voice was cool as a spoon laid on the eye. The kiss, she said, had been a childish gesture to kill gossip that she preferred the glamour of a uniform to the gravity of a ledger. She regretted its cruelty. She had not seen Henry after the cake was cut. "And you did not drink?" asked Poirot. "A sip only." He noticed her glove turn minutely, a restlessness disguised as poise. Oliver Trent protested the indecency of an inquiry before breakfast, then supplied his movements. Letters to post, a cigar on the terrace, a walk through the east corridor. He encountered Henry by the Palms around 1:30. Henry, humming, spoke of a meeting that would settle everything. With whom? Oliver did not know. A creditor, suggested Aunt Agatha. Oliver offered a narrow shrug. Possibly. Miss Iris Vale, Helena's companion, raised a tentative hand. She had seen Henry speaking with a man near the service stairs. No guest, rather one who had come late with the musician's van. The exchange had been brief and stiff. Before Poirot could press her, Pritchard announced that, per instruction, the conservatory was locked and left untouched. "Bon," said Poirot. "We will look with the eyes that do not hurry." They went together. The conservatory breathed damp heat and the narcotic sigh of orchids. On a chaise by the fountain lay the impression of a body now removed. A porcelain cup rested on a wrought iron stand. The saucer showed a sugared ring and one irregular grain that clung to the lip like a crystal. Poirot stood with his hands behind his back, an astronomer reading small lights. "Doctor," he said. Dr. Latham repeated his conclusion with reluctance. A rapid-acting poison, likely of the bitter almond family. A minute, perhaps 2. No obvious lesions in the mouth or throat. There had been a faint pale stain on the inside of Henry's right wrist, as though from dyed fabric damp with sweat. "A ribbon?" Poirot mused. "Perhaps," said the doctor, looking unhappy. Arkwright, questioned about chemicals, admitted to the usual stores, sprays, fumigants, fertilizers, all locked. He and Pritchard kept duplicate keys. No bottle was missing. Some labels had faded. "Labels," murmured Poirot, "are the conscience of bottles. When they fade, the conscience is tempted." He peered at the cup but did not touch it. On the tiles he observed smudges of damp soil that began without footprints and ended without them, as though something had been set down and lifted again. Under the chaise, half caught in the wicker, a crushed loop of white ribbon had escaped notice. Poirot bent, not to take it, but to consider the grimed edges, as if the ribbon had once bled color and now refused to bleed again. He straightened and looked at the orchids in precise ranks, each with a colored tag in Arkwright's careful hand. Order everywhere, and yet a man dead. Back in the corridor, Poirot paused with Charles. "You love order, monsieur," he said gently. "You have married a lady who wears disorder as if it were a veil." Charles flinched. Poirot's tone stayed kind. "Be courageous. Ask her the question you fear, but not yet. First, we will make the little inventory." He made it at once. To Pritchard he assigned the assembling of the staff in 1 hour. To Arkwright, a count of every vial, and a note of who had requested sprays in the last month. To Miss Vale, no duties but to rest. The color had fled her face at mention of the porter. To Oliver Trent, a request, furnish every letter Henry asked him to draft in the past fortnight. Oliver protested privilege. Poirot's eyebrows described a courteous arabesque. Oliver subsided. Only then did Poirot allow himself a final look at Helena. "Madame, last night you wore a ribbon with the house crest. This morning you wear it again in black. It is a brave symbol. Perhaps also a message." Her eyes did not blink. "A message to whom?" "To the one person who would be sure to read it," he said softly. He returned alone to the glass house. The orchids hung like thoughts. Somewhere, he told himself, there had been a single act of vanity upon which the contrivance turned. Find that, and the rest would click into place like buttons through narrow holes. He adjusted the porcelain cup by a hair's breadth, as though completing a diagram, and left with the certainty of 2 things: that Henry's death had been arranged to look like impulse, and that it was anything but. Pritchard assembled the servants in the small dining hall, portraits of stern Frobishers looking down as though judging their heirs for losing the knack of discretion. Poirot stood where the windows lit his face and left theirs in kinder shade. The butler named them with ceremonial care: Mrs. Baines the cook, Elsie the under-housemaid, Weller the footman, Finch the chauffeur, Dodd the night porter, and Tansy the florist's girl engaged for the week. He began with Dodd, a narrow man stitched from grey cloth. The musician's van, Dodd said, returned near 1 o'clock to fetch a mislaid metronome. He let them in at the service door and watched from the corridor beside the conservatory. "And you remained?" asked Poirot. "Until they left, sir. 10 minutes, perhaps 12. He heard 2 male voices by the palms, strained but low. One was Henry Frobisher, the other he could not place. After the van departed, he locked the yard gate and resumed his rounds. Elsie confessed in a quick rush that she had lingered to peep at the dancing and accepted a glass of champagne from Weller. Earlier, she had carried a tray of fresh cups to the conservatory. "They like to go there when it gets too warm," she said, and noticed a small jar of candied angelica left from the cake decorating. Later, when she gathered stray glasses, the jar had vanished. "Who knew of it?" asked Poirot. "Mrs. Baines, sir, and Miss Vale, who asked for it at dinner for the petits fours." The girl kept her eyes on the floor while she spoke, as though the tiles might provide an alibi. Mrs. Baines denied she let sweets go wandering. "Sugar sops the mind," she said, inviting contradiction and finding none. Poisons she kept locked, inventories written as scripture. No fumigant had left her pantry since early summer, because Mr. Arkwright preferred an orchid wash. "A wash?" Poirot inquired. "A liquid for pests, mild as milk to people unless drunk like a sailor. Mixed to Mr. Arkwright's recipe by the village chemist." She sniffed. "It smells of bitter almonds." Arkwright, summoned, conceded the fact without cheer. The wash was almond-scented. He swore it harmless at the concentrations used. "A vanity of gardeners," murmured Poirot, "to perfume even the war they wage." "Did he keep small droppers for decanting?" Arkwright flushed. "Yes. For convenience, a few unlabeled glass pipettes lay near the potting bench." "And who might take one without your notice?" "Anyone bold enough to cross a line," Arkwright said, glancing not at staff but at the door that led to the public rooms. Tansy had the quick, cornered eyes of a wild thing. She had tied ribbons to pew ends in the chapel and freshened the orchids at dusk. Henry, passing, had teased her about her name, a flower tending flowers, and asked whether orchids could be dyed. "Sometimes you can tint the cut stems," she told him. He had laughed and said it was a pity one could not tint people. That was all, she insisted, but Poirot noted the sap stain on her cuff the color of old tea and the little bite marks crowded into the ribbon round her wrist. When the staff were dismissed, Poirot walked with Pritchard along the wainscoted passage. "You are a man of loyalty," he said. "Loyalty can be the enemy of truth when it chooses whom to protect. Last night, whom did you protect?" Pritchard was silent long enough to count the knots in the oak. "The master," he said at last. "He was not himself. I took him coffee in his study after the orchestra left. Strong? Strong enough to steady a hand. And did it? For a time." In the library, Charles bent over a ledger as though numbers could shelter him. He did not look up as Poirot entered. "My brother was mercurial," he said. "He made enemies because he could not endure boredom." Poirot laid, upon the blotter, a loop of white ribbon recovered from beneath the chaise. "Do you recognize this?" Charles frowned. "From the wedding favors. The crest was stamped in blue." "And yet this bears no crest," Poirot said. "Observe the faint grime along the edge. Transfer from a damp surface." Charles looked puzzled, then wary, as if he had noticed that the rules of a game had changed. "Permit me Henry's clothes," said Poirot. Pritchard produced them with the gravity of an acolyte. On the right inner wrist of the shirt, faint and irregular, a pale wash caught the light. Poirot touched it with a glass rod barely moistened and brought it to his nose. The ghost of almonds, hardly more than a memory, teased the air. He said nothing, not even when Charles' breath shortened. Left alone, Poirot allowed the pattern to form as an image appears when one steps back from too close embroidery. There had been a cup, yes, but there had also been skin. The poisoner had wanted certainty. 2 vectors meant 2 opportunities. The cup to justify the place, the contact to guarantee the result, and vanity, some small flourish, had crept in. He thought of ribbons and dyed orchids, of talk of tinting people, and of a bride who kissed the wrong man beneath chandeliers, as if writing a signature she expected the world to read. He returned to the conservatory and stood among orchids, precise and expectant as a congregation. On the wrought iron stand, the porcelain cup's sugared rim glittered. On the tiles beside the chaise, damp smudges began without footprints and ended without them, the mark of a pot set down and lifted again. He crouched, examining a speck on the grout no larger than a seed. It shone like a pinhead of glass. Not sugar, he decided, but varnish, shellac from a ribbon's sealed edge, softened by warmth and pressure. Poirot straightened. Somewhere in Henry's last hour, a hand had arranged comfort, sweetness, perfume, and death, then tidied the scene with the vanity of a hostess plumping cushions. He would speak to Miss Vale next, and to Helena after, and between their versions the flourish would betray its owner. For murder, he reflected, is rarely content with anonymity. It desires a signature, even if the stroke is no more than the absence of a crest where one ought to be. Poirot found Miss Vale seated in the morning room, her embroidery idle upon her lap. The companion's features were neat but weary, as though she had long played a part that drained her of color. She rose when Poirot entered, and though she smiled, her eyes flickered with the unease of one who has rehearsed an alibi too often. He inclined his head courteously and asked if she might give him the benefit of her recollections, for, as he reminded her, small things observed by quiet eyes often proved of greatest consequence. She nodded, though her fingers worried the embroidery thread until it frayed. She had seen Henry after the scandal of the kiss. He was flushed, almost merry, but beneath it lay a tightness of temper. He had spoken briefly to her on the stair, teasing in his careless fashion, asking if she too would prefer a soldier to a banker. She had chided him, and he had laughed, yet there had been a certain edge to his mirth. Later, as she sought fresh air in the corridor, she saw him pause with a man in dark clothing near the service entrance. She could not identify the stranger, only recall that Henry seemed agitated, his hand gesturing in quick, sharp lines. Then she had returned upstairs, for the atmosphere below had grown intolerable with whispers. Poirot listened, his gaze steady, but when she faltered, he gently pressed. "Mademoiselle, there is something more. Regardez, the embroidery suffers for your silence. Speak freely, for the truth weighs less when shared." She bit her lip and admitted that Helena had confided in her earlier that week. The bride had spoken of a quarrel between Charles and Henry regarding finances. Helena had urged discretion, but the companion could not help fearing that this quarrel now cast its shadow over the death. Poirot thanked her with grave courtesy, yet in his eyes a faint light sparked. A quarrel between brothers could conceal motives deeper than pride. He next sought Helena herself. She was in the music room, hands moving over the keys of the piano with brittle determination, striking out a melody that wandered and broke apart. When Poirot entered, she ceased, folding her hands with a composure too exact. "Monsieur Poirot," she said coolly, "you come to question me again, though I have told all I know." Poirot bowed. "Madame, forgive me. But truth is like a fugue. It repeats, it develops, and only at the close is the theme complete. Permit me to hear once more your variation." She regarded him narrowly, then spoke. She admitted that her marriage had been one of arrangement more than passion. Charles offered security, Henry, danger. She denied any true attachment to Henry, though she could not deny his pursuit. The kiss at the wedding had been her act, not his, a whim of defiance to prove she would not be the docile ornament society expected. Yet afterwards, Henry had followed her, demanding to know if she would leave Charles. She laughed it off, but his eyes were dark. She had left him then and returned to the hall. That was the last she saw of him alive. Poirot observed the faint tremor at the edge of her mouth, the too straight angle of her back. He spoke softly. "Madame, the ribbon you wear is black, yet yesterday it was white with the crest. A change so swift. What does it signify?" She hesitated, then replied that her white ribbon had been soiled by spilled wine during the dancing, and she had chosen another. Poirot inclined his head but did not press further. The explanation was plausible, but he had seen the ghost of almond wash upon a sleeve, and the ribbon beneath the chaise, its crest absent, whispered of vanity, hiding intent. Later that afternoon, Poirot walked with Dr. Latham in the garden. The physician confessed unease. Henry had visited him secretly a fortnight earlier, complaining of palpitations and sudden sweats. Latham suspected not heart, but nerves, for Henry confessed he was troubled by debts. The doctor had prescribed rest and moderation, neither of which Henry seemed likely to pursue. "Debts, doctor, yes?" Poirot repeated. "And did he name the creditor?" The physician shook his head. "No names, only hints of a pressing hand, one who would not forgive." Poirot looked at the beds of roses, each pruned with neat precision, and murmured that money, like poison, often travels in vessels unseen until it arrives at the heart. By evening, the household was restless. Gossip and suspicion thickened the air. Aunt Agatha whispered dire theories about servants with secret vices. Charles kept to his study with shutters drawn. Helena dined without appetite, her gaze fixed upon the vacant chair at the table as though daring anyone to fill it. Poirot moved among them with quiet assurance, speaking little, observing much. His moustaches quivered with thought, his eyes catching each glance, each hesitation as threads in a tapestry. When at last the clock chimed 10, Poirot excused himself and retired to the conservatory once more. The orchids breathed their heavy perfume, as if the plants themselves conspired to mask truth. He bent again to the floor where varnish glinted faintly, and in the quiet he allowed the day's fragments to align. A ribbon without crest, a bride too calm, a brother bound by quarrels, a stranger near the service door, a vanished jar of candied angelica. Each piece lay separate, yet together they suggested not chance but orchestration. Poirot closed his eyes and let the order settle. Murder had been committed not in haste, but with artistry. The poison had required both opportunity and concealment, the flourish of vanity betraying the hand behind it. Soon he would gather them, these people bound by blood, marriage, duty, and desire, and each would play his or her part in the little drama. But first he must allow the shadows to deepen, for it is only in darkness that certain lights may be seen. He rose, adjusted a flower pot by a hair's breadth, and whispered to the orchids, "Patience, mes amis. The truth ripens like fruit, and tomorrow we shall taste it." The following morning broke with a veil of mist across the lawns of Belvoir Hall, and the hush of unease that had settled over the household seemed heavier than the fog. Poirot rose earlier than usual, his routine precise as always, his moustaches trimmed to symmetry, his suit pressed to perfection. Yet his eyes betrayed the wakeful night he had passed in thought. He descended to the breakfast room where only Aunt Agatha presided, pouring tea with a righteousness that clattered against the silence. "You will find, Monsieur Poirot," she said, with the air of a magistrate, "that indulgence is the mother of vice. Henry was a reckless boy, courting ruin. That girl," she gestured vaguely towards the corridor where Helena might at any moment appear. "She encouraged him. A woman's weapon, sir, is vanity, and vanity leads straight to wickedness." Poirot inclined his head, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, but her words lodged themselves in the growing architecture of his thoughts. Vanity again. Always vanity. As the others gathered, Poirot's gaze shifted between them with unobtrusive precision. Charles arrived late, pale and stiff, muttering apologies and refusing eggs. Helena entered composed, her gown immaculate, her gloves newly white, as though last night's black ribbon had been a passing fancy. Oliver Trent soon followed, a stack of papers under his arm, offering Poirot a discreet packet tied with twine. "The letters you asked for," he murmured, and Poirot took them with gratitude. Over breakfast, he leafed through them silently. They were drafts Henry had dictated to his solicitor, requests for loans, proposals for investments, hints of ventures in the colonies that promised quick profit, but smelled strongly of desperation. One draft, crumpled at the corner, stood out. It referred obliquely to a promised sum withheld at the very moment of need, and to the danger of exposure unless terms were met. Poirot slipped it aside, his expression unreadable, though in his mind the chords of motive sounded with deeper resonance. After breakfast, he requested to see Charles in the study. The elder Frobisher stood behind his desk, shoulders hunched as if bracing against an invisible storm. Poirot asked directly about Henry's debts. Charles confessed that his brother had begged for money only weeks before, and he had refused. He spoke with bitterness, recalling Henry's extravagance, his gambling, his careless charm that always drew sympathy from others, but left Charles to repair the damage. "And so you quarreled," Poirot said softly. Charles's eyes flickered. "Yes. Words were spoken, I regret. He threatened to disgrace me, but I did not kill him." His voice carried weariness, and Poirot, though not convinced of innocence, marked the tone carefully. Later, Poirot sought Helena in the rose garden. She stood among the flowers as if they owed her allegiance, her veil brushing the blooms like a benediction. He walked beside her slowly, letting silence stretch before he spoke. "Madame, when you kissed Captain Henry before all the guests, it was not an impulse only. There was in it a message. To whom was it addressed?" She laughed lightly, too quickly. "To no one, monsieur. To everyone. A bride may do as she pleases." Poirot shook his head gently. "A bride may please, yes. But a bride who pleases the wrong man, in the wrong way, at the wrong time, she writes a riddle that must be solved." Her eyes hardened, and for a moment her composure faltered. She turned away, bending to touch a rose whose thorns drew a bead of blood. She smiled at the crimson dot as if it confirmed something she alone understood. Poirot noted it, the indulgence in small symbols, the appetite for drama that could cloak calculation. By afternoon, the estate was abuzz with another discovery. Finch, the chauffeur, while cleaning the motor car, had found beneath a seat a folded scrap of ribbon, white and stained faintly with soil. Poirot examined it. This ribbon bore the crest faintly impressed, but blurred as if moisture had smudged it away. He compared it with the fragment taken from beneath the chaise, and saw that they belonged to the same set, though this second piece bore signs of deliberate handling. He asked who had ridden last in the car. Finch replied that it had been Henry himself, carried to the station earlier in the week for a meeting. Poirot's mind drew lines between these discoveries. The ribbons, the poison wash, the vanished jar of Angelica, the debts, the kiss. Yet still he lacked the fulcrum, the one truth upon which the lever of deduction could rest. He returned to the conservatory once more, alone, and walked the length of the tiled floor. His eyes traced the smudges, the faint varnish, the chair where Henry had sat. He closed his eyes and imagined the scene. Henry, flushed, restless, perhaps taunted by a promise of money or love. A drink placed beside him, a ribbon brushing his wrist, a moment of vanity that was also the sting of death. As he stood thus, Dr. Latham entered quietly, carrying a small vial. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I thought you should see this. It was among Henry's things in my surgery when he came to me last." The vial contained a tonic, harmless, but its stopper bore traces of the same faint bitter almond scent. Poirot inhaled, nodded, and replaced it. "Merci, docteur. You confirm for me that the poison was not carried here from afar. It was already at hand, close, domestic." Evening drew near once more, and Poirot gathered them all in the drawing-room under the heavy gaze of ancestral portraits. His eyes swept the company. Helena calm as marble, Charles grey with strain, Oliver tense with professional secrets, Miss Vale pale with guilt withheld, Arkwright grim with indignation, Aunt Agatha ready to pass sentence. He told them gently that murder was no intruder among them, but had been born from their own circle, out of vanity, pride, and fear. He did not yet name the hand, but his words struck like a bell, and each face flickered. He then dismissed them, bowing as if the evening had been no more than a concert's close. Alone in the hall, Poirot stood a moment longer, his small form perfectly erect. "The truth ripens," he whispered to himself. "It is nearly ready to be plucked. Tomorrow, mes amis, the mask will slip." The next day dawned clearer, as if the weather had decided to leave Belvoir Hall without excuses. Poirot breakfasted on half a roll, sipped chocolate, and sent 3 notes by Pritchard. One to Mrs. Baines for a dish of candied angelica to be placed in the conservatory, one to Mr. Arkwright requesting a wedding ribbon and a glass dropper, and one to Charles Frobisher asking leave to use the conservatory for a brief reconstruction. Poirot had arranged a small table, the porcelain cup upon its iron stand, the angelica gleaming like little green windows, and a coil of white ribbon on a plate. "Mes amis, we make the rehearsal," he announced. "We do not accuse, we remember. Each of you will tie the ribbon, as in a childish game. You will taste a morsel of angelica. You will stand. You will speak. You will forget that death has made you careful." Aunt Agatha declared the exercise unbecoming, but she tied the bow with ecclesiastical firmness and chewed angelica like a penance. Oliver Trent complied blandly, his gaze measuring the arrangement with a solicitor's cool curiosity. Miss Vale's hands trembled. She begged to be excused the sweet, and Poirot consented, thanking her for honesty. Arkwright knotted the ribbon clumsily and frowned at the cup as though it were a poorly staked tree. Charles submitted without complaint, jaw set. Helena allowed Pritchard to settle the ribbon at her wrist. Her stillness was something trained. "Très bien," murmured Poirot. "Now we mingle." He drifted among them, placing the cup at the height of a careless hand, and shifting a flower pot the breadth of a coin, brushing the drooping ribbon on Helena's wrist. The perfume of orchids, with the faint almond echo of Arkwright's wash, curled in the warmth. Poirot spoke lightly of polkas and petals and the foolishness of midnight feasts, watching who breathed freely and who held the breath. When at last he clapped his hands, Pritchard brought water for rinsing. "Merci," said Poirot. "We have remembered enough." "You dislike theatre," he said to Arkwright as they parted. "I dislike pretense among plants," the gardener answered. "And among people." "Plants don't lie," Arkwright said. "People prune the truth and think it will not show who has access to the chemist who mixes your wash." Arkwright listed himself, the chauffeur for pickups, and once, when a shipment failed, Mrs. Baines, who sent for more. In the corridor, Poirot encountered Dodd. On gentle prompting, the porter admitted something more about the musician's van. Not all who arrived departed by it. One man slipped into the shrubbery and later went out by the lane with a flat leather case. That afternoon, Finch stood like a schoolboy awaiting censure. Yes, he knew Len. Leonard Pepper, assistant to the chemist. Pepper had delivered a special at the hall. Arkwright, confronted, admitted requesting an extra small batch of concentrated wash for experiment on scale insects. Concentrated, Poirot repeated. Enough, perhaps, to mark a man through a ribbon? Arkwright reddened, but said the bottle had remained sealed until he tested a drop in the shed. Poirot believed the testing, yet it altered nothing important. He returned to the conservatory and examined the fragment of ribbon and the second piece found beneath the motor-car seat. Along the sealed edge of each lay a faint ridge of resin where shellac had softened and reset. In the weave lurked a dust so fine it might be pollen. When he breathed on it, the barest smear of almonds woke like a memory. Not sprinkled, he thought, but brushed, as one touches perfume to a glove, to mark a wrist and ensure the poison's entrance by the tender skin that knows no suspicion. Toward evening he invited Helena to walk upon the terrace. "Madame," he said gently, "you bear courage admirably, but courage is not the same as innocence. You think I wanted Henry dead." "I think," said Poirot, "that your nature loves the flourish, that you cannot resist the signature the world will see." A faint smile touched her mouth. "And what flourish do you attribute to me?" "The kiss, certainly. The choice of ribbons, the calm with which you wear them, the bow that falls where the pulse beats. Color rose, then receded. Competence is not guilt." "No," he agreed, "but habit is a road. Walk it often, and it leads to the place we began." At last, she said, "Lo, if I confessed, would you believe me?" "I would examine the confession like a jeweler," said Poirot. "If it is paste, I would return it." She gave a brittle laugh. "Then I will not waste your time yet." She turned away. He saw not malice, but a weary pride. He watched her go, then returned indoors, where the orchids breathed. Late that night he set the Angelica before him and held a ribbon to the lamp. Along the edge, beneath prettiness, lay the arrogance of murder. He breathed upon it once more. The almond thread stirred. "It is almost ready," he murmured. "One more truth, and the mask will slip for the moment." The next morning found the household restless, as though some invisible pressure weighed upon every corridor. Poirot had spent much of the night studying Henry's letters once more, placing them in precise order upon his desk as if arranging chess pieces. When he entered the breakfast room, only Miss Vale was present, her hands folded over her plate, though she had eaten nothing. She looked up with startled relief when Poirot greeted her, as if his calm presence steadied the room. He asked gently if she had slept. She admitted she had not, and after a pause confessed that Helena had returned late from the terrace the previous evening, her gown brushed with dew. Poirot thanked her softly, observing that sometimes it is in such trivial stains that truth chooses to reveal itself. Charles soon entered, his face pale, his hair slightly disordered. He ignored food and sat rigid at the table, drumming his fingers with the air of a man forced into patience. Poirot addressed him carefully, noting that Henry's letters suggested not only debts, but also a threat of exposure. Charles looked away, muttering that his brother was reckless, that he had threatened to speak of investments Charles had made with family funds. Poirot inclined his head but said no more, though the tension of silence thickened around them. Helena arrived last, composed as ever, her dress immaculate, a white ribbon again tied at her wrist. She offered a smile, too polished, too rehearsed, as if daring anyone to question it. Aunt Agatha scolded the household's gloom and insisted upon marmalade, but her sharp eyes missed little. Poirot excused himself once more and returned to the conservatory, where the orchids hung in patient silence. There he was joined by Oliver Trent, carrying yet another packet of documents. With a thin smile he remarked that Henry had left behind not only debts, but hints of a scandal involving a lady of standing. He produced a letter, half burnt at the edges, retrieved from Henry's desk. The lines that survived suggested some arrangement between Henry and a woman who feared discovery. The name was absent, yet the phrasing, "the risk to your marriage," The danger of your husband's wrath rang clear enough. Poirot thanked Trent, though his eyes betrayed no surprise. He knew already whose marriage would be risked, whose wrath might be provoked. Later, Poirot requested Pritchard to bring him the inventory of ribbons ordered for the wedding. The butler obliged, producing a ledger that recorded each batch, its crest stamped by the village stationer. Poirot noted a discrepancy: 30 ribbons unaccounted for, missing since the decorations were cleared. When asked who oversaw the packing, Pritchard admitted it was Helena and Miss Vale together. Poirot observed the faint quiver in the butler's voice, as though loyalty strained against conscience. He dismissed him gently, then lingered over the figures, tracing with one fingertip the number missing. 30 ribbons, ample opportunity for one to be tampered with, another to be discarded, a few to be placed strategically. That afternoon, Poirot summoned Dr. Latham once more. Together they examined the ribbon fragments under a magnifying glass. Latham confirmed what Poirot already suspected. The faint, crystalline dust was not sugar at all, but residue from a chemical base. Applied lightly to fabric, it would linger, dry and visible, and leave only the faint almond scent. Poirot nodded gravely. It was not the cup alone that carried death, Doctor. The hand that brushed the ribbon brushed the pulse as well. 2 paths to the same end. Our murderer sought certainty, and certainty is always the mark of fear. Meanwhile, whispers grew among the servants. Elsie confided to Poirot in a rush that she had seen Helena earlier in the week in the pantry, searching among jars, though she had no reason to be there. Helena had smiled when discovered and claimed to be hunting candied peel. Elsie had thought nothing of it until now. Poirot thanked her, his tone grave but kind, and assured her her honesty would not be forgotten. He knew well that servants see the gestures others hide, and those gestures accumulate like crumbs leading to the door. As evening descended, Poirot requested once more that the household gather in the drawing-room. He made no accusations, yet his words carried weight. He spoke of vanity, of flourishes that betray rather than conceal. He told them that the poison had been introduced not only to a cup, but also to a ribbon, that the certainty of Henry's death was too elaborate for chance. Faces tightened, eyes flickered. Helena's composure did not break, yet her fingers toyed with the ribbon at her wrist, and for a fleeting instant she seemed aware of the noose such small symbols might form. When he dismissed them, Poirot lingered in the room alone, pacing slowly beneath the heavy portraits. He reflected that every piece of the puzzle was now before him: the debts, the quarrels, the letters, the kiss, the vanished jar of Angelica, the tampered ribbons. Only the final arrangement was missing, the precise order in which the pieces locked together to reveal the culprit. But in his mind, the shape was already forming. He needed but one more demonstration, one final test to catch the murderer in a contradiction they could not escape. As he ascended the stairs, Poirot murmured to himself that vanity had left its fingerprints upon this crime as surely as any hand might leave them upon glass. And vanity, when pressed, would always betray itself again. That night the house slept uneasily. Poirot, in his chamber, wrote neat lines in a small notebook, not of accusation, but of order. He arranged facts as a musician arranges notes, each one in its rightful place, until a melody began to emerge. At dawn, he closed the book with a click of satisfaction, certain that the harmony of truth would soon be heard. By mid-morning, he requested Helena's presence in the conservatory, alone. She entered in a gown of pale ivory that seemed chosen with deliberate defiance, a white ribbon again binding her wrist. The orchids behind her glowed in the light, as though mocking the delicacy of her poise. Poirot bowed and gestured to the porcelain cup still resting upon the stand. "Madame, yesterday you explained that your ribbon had been soiled by wine, hence its replacement. Permit me a question. How many ribbons did you possess?" She smiled faintly. "Dozens. The stationer delivered boxes of them. Surely ribbons are no matter for suspicion. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but sometimes it is precisely the triviality that condemns. Consider 30 missing, 1 found beneath the chaise, another in the motor car. Coincidence? Non, madame, it is a pattern. Helena's fingers tightened upon her glove, but she did not reply. Poirot leaned closer, voice gentle. You are a woman of courage, yes, but courage cannot undo what is done. The kiss was your flourish, your signature. The ribbon, too, bore the mark of your hand. Vanity, madame, is the little mirror in which truth admires itself before the world. Her eyes flashed, but she retained her calm. If you believe this, monsieur, prove it before them all. Otherwise, it is nothing but suggestion. Poirot inclined his head gravely, as though granting her wish. He spent the afternoon preparing the stage. Pritchard arranged chairs in the drawing-room, and at Poirot's instruction placed upon the central table 3 objects, the porcelain cup, the jar of angelica newly fetched from the pantry, and the 2 ribbon fragments. Poirot sat alone before them as the family and guests assembled, each face tight with expectation. Aunt Agatha muttered about theatrics. Charles stared into the hearth. Oliver Trent positioned himself with a lawyer's wariness. Helena entered last, serene, her ribbon glimmering at her wrist like a defiant badge. Poirot rose. His voice was low, yet carried with the certainty of command. Mesdames et messieurs, we are gathered because among us dwells the hand that ended Captain Henry's life. I shall not weary you with repetition. You know already of his debts, his quarrels, his threats. These are motives, yes, but motives do not pour poison. It is the method, the vanity of the method, that unmasks the criminal. He lifted the cup. Poison was placed here. That alone might suffice. But Henry was not a man to drink deeply without suspicion. The poisoner sought certainty, a double assurance, and so, he raised the ribbon fragment. A flourish was added. Poison brushed upon a ribbon, transferred to the tender skin of the wrist, where the pulse beats quick. A gesture of elegance that became a gesture of death. Gasps rippled through the room. Poirot continued, his moustaches bristling with precision. 2 ribbons were found, one beneath the chaise, another in the motor car. Both bore traces of the wash used by Mr. Arkwright for his orchids. Both lacked the crest that stamped the others. Only one among us had cause to possess and change these ribbons with such frequency. Only one wore them not as decoration of the hall, but as adornment of her own wrist. Every gaze turned to Helena. She did not flinch. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, though the whiteness of her knuckles betrayed strain. You accuse me, Monsieur Poirot, she said evenly, and yet you cannot prove that I touched Henry with such a ribbon, nor that I placed the cup beside him. All you have are flourishes, as you call them, shadows of vanity, not deeds. Poirot inclined his head. Madame, it is true I cannot show you with the hand caught in the act. But I can show you with logic, with psychology. Who else kissed Henry before all eyes? Who else needed to silence the talk that would follow, lest her marriage collapse before it began? Who else had access to the pantry jar of angelica and to the ribbons ordered in her name? The servant saw you there, madame. And who else, if not you, returned late last night from the terrace, your gown brushed with dew, while the rest of the house slept? It is not one fact. It is many. Together they compose a picture as sharp as any portrait on these walls. The silence was profound. Charles rose unsteadily, his face drained. Helena, tell him he is wrong. For a moment she looked at her husband with something like tenderness, then her lips curved into a smile brittle as glass. Monsieur Poirot is clever, perhaps too clever, but cleverness does not make truth. Believe what you wish. Poirot's eyes rested upon her, calm and inexorable. Madame, denial is the last refuge of pride. But pride cannot erase order. The pattern is clear, and soon, when I present the final piece, it will be undeniable. The murderer of Captain Henry is revealed not by the poison, but by the vanity of the flourish. And vanity, madame, is yours. Helena's smile did not break, but her shoulders stiffened. Poirot turned from her to the others, declaring that on the morrow he would deliver the complete solution, step by step, leaving no doubt. For tonight, let them rest, though he doubted they would. He bowed, dismissed them, and remained alone, gazing at the ribbons gleaming under lamplight. In their faded crests he read the handwriting of murder, and in Helena's silence he heard confession unspoken. The stage was set. The final act would soon begin. The house was subdued after Poirot's declaration, but tension hummed in every corridor. The servants whispered in corners, guests avoided each other's eyes, and Charles prowled the study like a man waiting for a verdict. Helena remained composed, her presence gliding through the rooms with such studied calm that it seemed almost theatrical, as though she had rehearsed serenity in a mirror. Poirot, however, was untroubled by her poise. He knew that composure is often a mask stretched tautest when fear presses most from within. The following morning, he requested that Oliver Trent bring him the rest of Henry's correspondence. Oliver arrived with reluctance, producing 2 envelopes he had held back. One contained a draft of a letter Henry had intended for Helena, written in feverish strokes. It begged her to choose him openly, promised escape, and threatened to reveal secrets if she remained silent. The second was addressed to Charles, but never sent, a note that accused him of hypocrisy and hinted at improprieties in his business affairs. Poirot read both slowly, then folded them with a sigh. 2 letters, 2 threats, one to the wife, one to the husband. Such is not the strategy of a man secure. It is the cry of a drowning swimmer clutching for any hand to pull him free. He summoned Charles next. The elder Frobisher admitted the letter's truth, that Henry had threatened exposure if money was not forthcoming. But he swore that on the night of the reception he had locked himself in the study after dismissing the orchestra. He produced Pritchard as witness to his agitation. Poirot listened gravely, but reminded him that opportunity, not just motive, must be proved. Charles pressed his hands against his desk and whispered that, though he had wished Henry gone, he had not wished him dead. Poirot observed that a man may strike his brother with words sharper than any blade, yet it does not make him a murderer. Charles's shoulders sagged as though momentarily relieved, though fear still lived in his eyes. Later, Poirot visited Miss Vale in her chamber. She received him nervously, a bundle of embroidery abandoned upon the bed. With gentle questions, he coaxed from her a detail she had tried to forget. On the evening of the wedding, Helena had dismissed her early, instructing her not to follow when she retired. Miss Vale obeyed, though she later heard footsteps on the stair well past midnight. She had assumed they were Helena's. Poirot asked her carefully to recall whether Helena returned to her room before or after Henry was last seen alive. Miss Vale admitted it must have been after, for she had lain awake, and the clock had chimed 1:30 before she heard the door close. Poirot thanked her, his expression unreadable, though inside he felt the pattern tightening. By dusk, he walked alone in the garden, his thoughts precise as measured steps upon the gravel. He reflected that Helena had motive, the scandal of the kiss, the threat of exposure, the humiliation before society. She had means, the jar of Angelica, the ribbons, access to the conservatory. And she had opportunity, her absence noted at the very time Henry was last seen. Yet Poirot was not content with probabilities. He required certainty, not only for himself, but for justice. The certainty would come from psychology, not chemistry. For vanity, he knew, always seeks the stage, and it was upon the stage of confrontation that the truth would be compelled to speak. That evening he dined with the household. Conversation was sparse, each word weighted with suspicion. Poirot observed Helena carefully. When Aunt Agatha remarked that ribbons were a frivolous extravagance, Helena's lips curved into a faint smile, as if the remark confirmed her secret rather than challenged it. Poirot stored away the expression, another fragment in his quiet mosaic. Charles drank more than usual. His eyes shadowed. Oliver spoke only of trivial matters, but his hands fidgeted with his napkin until it tore. Miss Vale remained pale and silent. After the meal, Poirot rose and requested that all gather once more in the drawing-room on the morrow for the final resolution. His voice was calm, yet it carried authority that none dared dispute. Helena lifted her chin and met his gaze with a composure that bordered on defiance. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Let us hear this final truth you claim to hold." Her words were measured, but there was a glint in her eyes, as if she were daring him to produce proof that did not exist. Poirot bowed slightly, his moustaches stiff with precision. "The truth, madame, requires only patience. And tomorrow it shall be complete." When at last the household retired, Poirot remained awake in the drawing-room, studying once more the porcelain cup, the angelica, and the ribbons laid before him. He traced their arrangement with the care of a chess master rehearsing the endgame. At last he smiled faintly, murmuring in French, "It is ready. The little grey cells are satisfied. Tomorrow the curtain shall rise, and the vanity that sought to hide will instead betray." And so the night closed over Belvoir Hall, heavy with expectation, the silence of the old house like the pause before a verdict. None slept easily, for each knew that with the dawn Poirot would summon them, and in his precise, unyielding fashion would strip away every mask until only the naked truth remained. The following morning broke crisp and clear, as though the world itself wished to witness what was to unfold. By Poirot's command, the drawing-room was prepared once more, chairs arranged in a semicircle beneath the solemn portraits of Frobisher ancestors. The table at the center bore the porcelain cup, the jar of candied angelica, and the fragments of ribbon displayed beneath a glass dome. One by one the household assembled, each compelled by curiosity and fear. Charles entered first, his face drawn, a man bracing himself for inevitable humiliation. Oliver Trent followed with a lawyer's stiffness, clutching his notebook as if law could shield him from conscience. Aunt Agatha arrived with her walking stick and her sharper tongue, muttering about indecency, but eager to witness revelation. Miss Vale came pale, her hands knotted, trembling beneath her shawl. At last Helena appeared, composed in ivory once again, the ribbon at her wrist gleaming like defiance itself. She seated herself directly opposite Poirot, her gaze steady, her smile faint and cool. Poirot rose, bowing slightly. His voice carried not drama, but measured authority, each word placed as carefully as a piece upon a chessboard. "Mesdames et messieurs, you have been patient while I allowed the little grey cells their work. Today we conclude. Captain Henry Frobisher did not die by chance, nor by his own folly. He was murdered with deliberation. The means were poison, yes, but not in the simple fashion we might expect. It was not enough to tamper with a cup. Our murderer wished certainty, and certainty, mes amis, came through vanity." He lifted the ribbon fragment delicately. This ribbon was brushed with the concentrated orchid wash, bearing the faint bitter scent of almonds. A ribbon tied at the wrist of one who leaned close to Henry, who touched him in apparent jest or affection, would transfer the poison to his skin. From there, absorbed swiftly, it sealed his fate. It was a flourish, unnecessary to the crime, but irresistible to the nature of the culprit. For vanity, you see, cannot resist the chance to sign its work. Gasps stirred the room. Poirot's mustaches twitched as he continued. The cup, too, bore traces, so that suspicion might fall upon anyone who drank with Henry. But the ribbon, that is the true signature. 2 fragments were found, one beneath the chaise, another in the motor car, both missing their crest, both marked by resin and faint chemical dust. They betray the hand of one who changed ribbons often, who treated them as costume rather than decoration. That person is among us. His eyes swept the room, resting at last upon Helena. Charles shifted in his chair, his face ashen. "Poirot, surely not." Helena could not. Poirot lifted a hand. "Attend, monsieur. The motive is clear. Henry threatened exposure. He pursued Madame openly, humiliating both bride and groom before all society. She could not endure scandal, nor could she permit him to destroy her marriage on its first day. Thus, she resolved to silence him with certainty and with flourish, concealing the act beneath the elegance of her own vanity." Helena's lips curved in a brittle smile. "You weave patterns out of air, monsieur. Ribbons, kisses, vanity. Where is your proof?" Poirot bowed. "Proof, madame, is here, in the psychology of the deed. Only you had both the reason and the temperament to execute such a flourish. Only you dismissed your companion, Miss Vale, that night so you might be free to meet Henry alone. Only you lingered in the pantry earlier in the week, searching among the jars," the vanished Angelica now explained. "Only you were absent at the very hour Henry was last seen alive. And only you wear upon your wrist the emblem of the crime." He gestured, and Pritchard, solemn as a clerk of court, stepped forward with a small handkerchief. Poirot nodded toward Helena's wrist. "If you permit, madame." For a moment she sat still, then slowly extended her arm. Pritchard dabbed the fabric gently. A faint discoloration stained the cloth, pale but unmistakable. Poirot held it aloft. Even now, days after, the residue lingers. Vanity may replace ribbons, but it cannot so quickly replace the truth. The room erupted in whispers, gasps, exclamations. Charles staggered to his feet, his face stricken. Helena remained seated, her composure now cracked by the tremor of her hands. She lifted her chin, though, and her voice rang clear. "Yes, I did it. Henry would not relent. He threatened to drag me down before all of you, to disgrace me and destroy the life I had chosen. I could not allow it. He mocked me even in his last moments, laughing as though my marriage were a jest. I ended it, and I would do so again." Aunt Agatha rose with a gasp of outrage, declaring the scandal greater than the crime itself. Charles stared at his wife as though seeing her for the first time, torn between horror and an unwilling admiration of her courage. Helena met his gaze without flinching. "You may despise me, Charles, but at least you are free of him now." Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Madame, the law will decide your fate. I do not gloat, for murder is always the failure of the heart before it is the triumph of the mind. Yet know this, it was not your necessity that betrayed you, but your vanity. The kiss, the ribbons, the flourish, these were the handwriting of your crime. Without them, perhaps, Henry's death might have been written as chance. But vanity is impatient to be admired, and so it reveals the truth." Helena laughed softly, a sound brittle as glass. "Then I am guilty of vanity indeed, Monsieur Poirot. Let them write it in the papers. The bride who kissed the wrong man, and killed him too." She rose, tall and unbowed, and allowed herself to be led away. Poirot watched her go, his expression grave. When silence returned, he turned to the others. "Justice is never pleasant, mes amis, but order, it must be restored. And now it is." He glanced once more at the ribbons beneath the glass dome, then gathered his hat and cane. As he departed the hall, the September sun cast long shadows across the gravel, and Poirot murmured to himself, "So often it is not hatred nor greed that unmasks the murderer, but vanity, the little flourish that insists upon being seen." The departure of Helena from the drawing-room left a silence so complete that the tick of the mantel clock seemed suddenly thunderous. Charles remained standing, staring at the door through which his wife had passed, his features rigid as though carved in stone. Aunt Agatha muttered prayers beneath her breath, though they sounded more like condemnations. Miss Vale wept quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Oliver Trent sat with pen motionless, unable to shape into words what the law would soon demand of him. Poirot, still in his place at the center, let the silence endure until its weight settled firmly upon every soul. At last he spoke, gently, without triumph. "Mes amis, the truth has revealed itself, as it always must. The crime was not born of malice only, but of fear. Fear of scandal, fear of humiliation, and yet fear does not absolve, it condemns." Captain Henry sought to bend life to his reckless desires, but in pressing too far, he brought about his own undoing. Madame Helena sought to preserve dignity through murder, but dignity bought with death becomes only ruin. Charles turned to him with haunted eyes. "And what of me, Monsieur Poirot? Am I to live with this shame forever?" Poirot laid a hand gently upon his arm. "Monsieur, you must live with truth, not shame. The shame belongs to the crime, the truth belongs to you. If you have courage to face it, time will restore some measure of peace, but it will be a different peace than the one you dreamed of. Such is the cost of pride and silence." Aunt Agatha sniffed sharply. "The family name is ruined." Poirot shook his head. "No, madame. Families endure worse than scandal. What ruins is not the deed itself, but the refusal to face it with honesty. Speak plainly, and time will soften memory. Hide, and it will fester." She said nothing more, though her eyes glistened with something nearer to grief than fury. Poirot gathered the cup, the ribbons, and the jar of Angelica, placing them together in a small case. "These trifles," he said, "were the instruments of death. But remember, it was not the poison that betrayed her. It was vanity. Always it is the unnecessary flourish that unmasks the murderer. The flourish is their pride, and pride, mes amis, leaves its footprints more plainly than any physical evidence." He bowed to them all, his departure as precise and composed as his arrival had been. On the steps of Belvoir Hall he paused, drawing his coat close against the September air. The morning sun glowed upon the lawns, serene, indifferent to the ruin that lay within. He turned once, saw Charles framed in the doorway, and raised his hat in silent farewell. Then, with measured stride, Hercule Poirot descended to the waiting car. As the vehicle rolled down the gravel drive, Poirot settled back against the seat, his eyes half closed, his mustaches quivering with thought. "Always," he murmured to himself, "it is the little grey cells, the order, the psychology. To understand the heart, that is the true detection, and to understand vanity, that is to read the handwriting of the soul." He allowed himself the faintest smile. Justice, imperfect but inevitable, had been served. Humanity, with all its weaknesses and contradictions, had once again revealed itself in full measure. Poirot leaned back, closing his notebook with finality. The case of The Bride Who Kissed the Wrong Man was finished. And as the countryside slid past the window, he whispered softly, "It is not the crime that fascinates, but the frailty behind it. Toujours, it is human nature.